And ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is 3:16, I think, on the west coast of the United States of America. Sorry for the hour and so delay. Had some family things that I needed to take care of, and because of that, we had to start late. So I thought we were going to start at 3:15, because I needed to eat, because if I didn't eat, I'd be a very grumpy individual sitting in front of you. So I was home right before 3, but took a little time to eat, and that's, again, like I said, I know if I don't eat what it does to me, and I've learned that over the years. So I gotta eat. We'll wait for people to jump in here as we get adjusted and readjusted, as always. And then we're gonna jump into our reaction video with Jordan Peterson and his crew, folks. I don't remember every single person's name, but he's going to introduce us to every single person. We're going to do a Bible study like we've done as it's come out. This one was released today. And we're going to be looking at the 10 plagues. This is probably by far, my favorite part of the book of Exodus, because of the many, many really awesome things that are taking place in it. And so, yeah, I love it. And hopefully we'll explain kind of the background to it and what's going on. But again, we're going to wait for some folks to jump in here and join us. Drop a comment below. Tell us what's going on. Hit that like button because it helps. As I can tell, there's not many of you guys have hit the like button. And maybe some people are confused and thinking I wasn't streaming today, but we're here, and they're getting the notifications, and they'll be coming and joining us. Okay, so Nick, what's going on, my brother? What is going on with you? I got my coffee ready. Nice and warm. Something to write with. Something to write on. We'll be jumping into this. Just about now. Well, folks, this is part 4 of the Exodus series. This is the 10 plagues that they're going to be focusing on. We will be responding to this. This is, again, from the Daily Wire Plus and Jordan Peterson. It's on Jordan Peterson's channel. The original video link is in the description box. You can go check that out. So let's just jump into that. Why don't we? It is a little bit sped up, so we can get through 2 hours of content that we're reacting to. That's predominantly the reasons we do that.
Hello, everyone watching and listening. We're on day 4 of the Exodus seminar. I brought a number of people together to walk through Exodus, partly in preparation for a series of public lectures I want to give next year. I'll just briefly introduce everyone, and we'll jump into Exodus 7, because that's where we closed off yesterday. On my right is Jonathan Pajot, Stephen Blackwood, Dennis Prager, Greg Hurwitz, James Orr, Oz Guinness, and Douglas Headley. Very good collection of thinkers and raconteurs, and we'll jump right into the text again, Exodus 7. And the Lord said unto Moses, See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. And a mysterious part of the text, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt, and bring forth mine armies, and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt, by great judgments. So God, in some sense, here is revealing an overarching plan that's going to cause a fair bit of trouble for both the Israelites and the Egyptians, well, certainly in the Pharaoh in the meantime. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch forth mine hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded them, so did they. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, show a miracle for you, then thou shalt say unto Aaron, take thy rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did so in like manner with their enchantments. For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Now there's an echo there. I want to talk about the hardening of the heart issue, but there's an echo there in 7:12. Aaron's rod is the staff of Aaron, the tradition of Aaron. It's power and state, in some sense, handed down from God through Moses to Aaron. And the idea that that rod devoured all the serpents and rods that the Egyptians could produce is an indication that that tradition and power is superordinate. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. And what do you make of that, Jonathan? What do you make of the hardening of the heart? Because it's a tricky part.
Sorry about that, guys. I'd muted myself. So I'm not convinced that, as I've said always in this series, that you just immediately jump to this conclusion of, oh, the rod is power and strength and stuff like that. Because if that's true, that would also mean that the turning the water into blood, all the other miraculous things that are happening are some sort of a thing like that as well. But rather, what we're going to see is those things are actual events that happen that have overarching narrative teachings on it. Okay, so if the Nile is worshipped as a deity and Moses turns it into blood, that shows the authority of Yahweh. Let me put it this way, that shows the authority of Moses, and therefore that shows the authority of Yahweh over that thing which the Egyptians worship. But you don't get that. It's just like, oh, it's his tradition and authority, just reading into the text. And he says this, and Jonathan just says yes. Like, we've concluded this is just the case. And I would just press him on that and say, I don't think that is the case.
Part of the text, right? It's like, well, why would God make the Pharaoh even more tyrannical than he otherwise would, when he could do the opposite in principle?
Well, I think, first of all, you've got it right. I think that that's exactly what hardening of the heart is. Because we have to understand the idea of the heart. The notion of the heart is the center of the person. Remember when Moses put his hand out and then brought it back to the middle, and bringing it back to the middle was the healing of the hand. And so the idea of hardening of the heart is very interesting because
It's hardening the center.
It's right, exactly. We tend to think of the center as being good, and we're right, but there's a manner in which the center, the identity of something, can become tyrannical. So we're right, but there's a interesting because
It's hardening the center.
It's right, exactly. We tend to think of the center as being good, and we're right, but there's a manner in which the center
is not good. The Bible says the heart is wicked above all things. Who can know it but the Lord your God? The center is not good. I don't know what Jonathan means by that we are right, like the center of the man is good. Again, if he means that like our natural persons and our natural inclinations are good, then he's wrong. Very simply put, biblically, he's wrong on the subject. If he means something else, if he means like, well, God created us good in the original purposes of God, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know where he's going with this stuff, but we'll see.
The identity of something can become tyrannical. So in hardening of the heart, then we see the Pharaoh become more tyrannical. It helps us see that that's what it is. It's actually, so what the Pharaoh would need would actually be of some water, would be a bit of snake, a bit of flexibility for to be able to see the change that's coming. But because his heart is so hard, he can't see what's going on.
Right. So
he
that,
won't change.
That is very reminiscent of a totalitarian
that's
structure.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah.
the borders.
There's another, do you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
All right, so there's another different read on the hardening, which, by the way, alternates with strengthening. Both verbs are used. He strengthened Pharaoh's heart and hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I accept the following explanation, which I think was first given by Maimonides, not by me.
That's Moses Maimonides, by the way,
but I can't take it.
The great medieval Jewish philosopher.
By doing this, God gave Pharaoh freedom of choice. Mm-hmm. If I twist your arm and then you do what I asked you to do, you didn't do it willingly.
Right. So even the tyrant is allowed by God to have his freedom of choice.
Absolutely. So God strengthened his heart and did not make the plagues the reason that Pharaoh did what he did. He made him strong enough to withstand the plagues and do what he really wanted to do, which is not allow the Israelites to leave.
That makes so much more sense.
That's a very interesting take. Now, I haven't read that from Maimonides, but that is a very, very interesting take. So instead of hardening in the sense of like forcing him not to, he strengthens him to withstand his own acts.
Doesn't it?
It makes sense because the heart is the seat of the will. In Hebrew thinking, is the seat of the mind as well. So that fits nicely.
It goes with the center idea.
Right,
Yes.
right. So it's not as if God is overriding Pharaoh's will, but guaranteeing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So he's going to let the tyrant play out the role of tyrant fully.
Some rabbis say he's at the top. Pharaoh's at the top of his game till the end.
Oh, right. Okay.
And that
So there's
sets up
that
the
element
sort
too.
of cosmic elements of the full contest.
Right. So
But
okay.
to
So
back
then,
up John's point, you also have. The Pharaoh hardens his heart in the first 5 plagues. It only says the Lord does it in the last 5.
That's
not in the
interesting.
first 5. In other words, by that stage,
He needed help to have a strengthened heart
judgment
then.
is partly people being left to the consequence of their own settled choices.
Sure.
I think Augustine says something similar, doesn't he? He says, the God hardens Pharaoh's heart just means God shows how hard Pharaoh's heart really is. It reveals his true will.
It also makes sense that if this story is going to have an archetypal role in some sense, the tyrant has to be the real thing, right? And so he's really tyrannical to begin with, and then like tyrants, he actually doubles down, which is exactly what they do. And so if he wasn't like super tyrant, this wouldn't be the ultimate story of freedom from tyranny. In some
From a straight
sense.
narrative perspective, it's not that interesting if he's immediately won over by frogs, right? It's like there has to be a process, right? Given
Or
the
by
course,
Deus Ex Machina.
right? I mean, given the degree and extent of his sort of deprivations or his dehumanization of the Israelites, there has to be a process. It can't be easy, right? I have a very quick question. Does anyone know, and I imagine this is a Dennis question, why are some of the verbs italicized and the nouns, just specific words are italicized in the text and others aren't, and it seems somewhat arbitrary? Does anyone have an explanation for that?
Show me, that would be in the King James, right? Yeah, I'm using, so give me an example of an italicized.
Pharaoh's heart is hardened. The is italicized.
That's very, there
He
must
says,
be a
take
reason
thy rod
that they
and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a servant.
I know a
answer
little bit
because-
about 17th century
Go ahead.
italicization. It really has no rhyme or reason to it. That's
That's the best answer possible.
I don't know.
It looks like an overwrought screenplay, like if you're an amateur screenwriter and they put everything in caps, like to make the action verbs more
I
action-y.
think
Or a YouTube commenter. You can tell this is important because it's in caps and it's bold plus
An
exclamation mark.
exclamation point,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
The emoji.
He knows about those YouTube comments coming in when somebody's like writes you a paragraph in all caps. If you're a YouTube person, you're gonna see that. If you haven't already, you will one of these days.
These are also puzzling, but we can deal with that.
There's also a sense, I think, in which, in the largest sense, the hardening of the heart in verse 3, I harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. So it's Pharaoh's hardening of his heart that you might say allows for the glory of God to be shown forth. And in a certain sense, if what's being revealed to the Israelites is God as the fundamental principles of the real itself. What it means is that
Superordinate to the Pharaoh,
there's
even
no,
the Pharaonic
there's no
tyrant.
resisting that. I mean, and of course we know that hearts are hard. Now, we were just talking about COVID a second ago and the insane COVID regulations, the ramping up of these things. But it's not as though those things happen without consequence, right? I mean, those things are themselves subject to the deeper order, according to which we will judge them, whether we're shut out of the theaters or the economy tanks or whatever. So yes, you can harden the heart and double down and ramp up the regulations, but not also be immune from the deeper structures to which you're subject.
Well,
Jordan, there's another.
Go ahead.
Verse 7, before we pass on, I love the Hebrew sense of time. And here you have this wonderful, Moses was 80. Now, John could tell us the significance of 80, but what's significant for me is that in the scriptures, the heroes are often introduced with their age at the very moment they do the thing they're called to do. So Joseph is described as 30 when he stands before the Pharaoh. And everything is built up to that. And here's Moses now. He's before the Pharaoh. He's 80. Now, you could tell us the significance.
I'm not sure what the symbolism of 80 is, but I know for sure there's an interesting, many of the characters are quite old, and it's pretty astounding to have Abraham be so old when the story's happening. You almost have to remind yourself of how old they are when you're reading the story, because what Moses is doing is not what you imagine an 80-year-old.
Is it better late than never? Is it something like that?
I think in the case of Moses, there's that whole process of escaping Egypt. You can understand that in a way Moses goes through a process personally of what then Israel will go through later. He's like a little microcosm of the whole story. But the one thing that I want to point out in terms of the hardening of the heart as well, which interesting enough, because one of the structures that I've been seeing in this text is also related to the Tower of Babel, because the plagues are an undoing of creation. We'll look at it. There are other aspects to it, but one of them is definitely an undoing of creation. But before that, there comes the tyranny. And there's something about the fact that in the Tower of Babel, God comes down and says, like, they're going to do their will, and then God undoes it. And that you see that something like that. It's like, well, the Pharaoh will do his will, but it's not going to succeed because his will is so tyrannical that it actually calls upon, it's brittle. It becomes brittle ultimately.
The other thing for me that's so interesting with the rod swallowing the other rods, right, of showing the dominance of the Israelite God, but the plagues themselves are, like, from a narrative structural perspective, what's so amazing is they individually decimate all the Egyptian gods.
Yes. Yes. They individually decimate the Egyptian gods. That's very, very important to realize when it comes to the plagues.
Right, because all of the plagues are tied to an Egyptian god of one sort or another. So like the rod swallowing the other rods, right, it's he comes in, and that's another reason why the heart has to be strengthened or hardened, because it has to go through and clean out all the other gods, right, one by one. It's a great
So it's a re-representation of the idea of the battle of gods in heaven and the emergence of the dominant god, so to speak, the movement towards monotheism. So, and you get...
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. This is very interesting, right? Like, it's this battle that happens in heaven, and then one of them emerges. The thing about the God of the Hebrews is there is no competitor. He is the one in the beginning who created the heavens and the earth. There is no battle of an emergence of a monotheism. There is no battle with the emergence of, like, say, Baal, right? Where there's a competition and infighting and stuff, or what you see in, like, the Greek mythology. There is no competitor to Yahweh. There is none like him. The Bible regularly says there's none like him. So what is it really? Well, it is very simply a battle between the gods of Egypt and the God of the Jews, who are the slaves. In the ancient world, it generally would have been thought that if you were enslaved, if you had lost a battle or a war, your gods were weaker than the gods of the conquering nation. So the idea coming into the situation is thinking that the Egyptian gods are stronger than the God or the gods of the Israelites. We're going to be shown here that the weaker party has a stronger God. And there's an overarching reason as to why this stronger God in the first place allowed these people to go through this suffering and hard time. And the reason for that is because the time of the people in Canaan, the Canaanites, hadn't been fulfilled for them to be judged for the wickedness of their actions. Remember, this was spoken about, this God of the Jews to Abraham, about them being sojourners and so on and so forth. Like, it comes together. And I think they're missing that a little bit when it comes to how the totality of the story is connected together. It's a wonderful and beautiful narrative when you connect all the dots. If you miss that, you're going to start saying some random stuff.
This foreshadowing here again, that even though the Pharaoh can call on his wise men like God has called on Moses and Aaron, and even though the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians can bring out the rods and turn them into serpents, which in some sense means Pharaoh can call on a power that's equivalent to the power God can call on, then God trumps him with the victory of Aaron's rod over.
It's a deliberate parallelism. It just illuminates by contrast the strength and glory of God.
Right, while also not demeaning the Pharaoh. It's like he's got some tricks too, and they're not trivial.
Yeah, and that'll go on all through the plagues. You see the same structure where the magicians actually perform the same plague. So
only to a certain point. They only can replicate to a certain point, and after that, they're nowhere to be found.
Yeah. It's definitely in there.
But only in the first two.
Yeah, and then after that, it's like they run out of steam. That's right.
And what's interesting, I mean, we're jumping ahead a bit, but they drop out with the gnats and the fleas. And again,
that's
some
a
of the
good
rabbis,
time to leave town.
No, well, the rabbis say Egypt is monumental. Gigantic statues, incredible pyramids. What they're beaten by is a flea. The Lord's
That's
joke.
right. Yeah.
Another of the Lord's jokes.
There's a great joke coming up, and I'm not going to
good.
I just want to make one point about, I didn't want to interrupt while you were reading. Very, very important in my opinion. It says, and Aaron will be your prophet, right? You just read that? So I don't know why it happened, but it was a terrible mistake, and I love King James Version. I'm glad you're using it. I love it. And that is, the Hebrew does not mean prophet. The Hebrew means spokesman.
Yeah.
And I don't know why prophet was used. Prophet conjures up person who tells the future. That's the last.
That's not true necessarily, remember? Prophets in the Bible aren't just people who tell the future. As a matter of fact, most prophecy in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Dennis should know this, is individuals that are forth-telling the law of God. They're your spokesmen. All the prophets in the Old Testament are the spokesmen of God, who are telling the people of God, repent, believe, do not harden yourselves against God, do not harden your hearts against God. So it's the same thing.
Basically of prophets. They're all God's spokesmen. And that's exactly here. He's not going to be a prophet. He's going to be the spokesman. So just know that. It's the Navi is the Hebrew word, and it doesn't mean one who tells the future. It means spokesman.
Yeah, but I think in most Christian traditions, there's a more subtle understanding of what a prophet is as well, because even we know that the judges are prophets, that it's just basically people who manifest the will of God in the world.
Right,
so it's more a vernacular
Right, but has spokesman been used always rather than prophet?
Well,
it would be more accurate.
Prophtemi in Greek, I think, means to literally to speak out, to proclaim.
That's right.
And so maybe that was how the confusion
that's interesting.
prophetes. It doesn't just mean a predictor, but one who declares, speaks out,
It
speaks
became predictor, but it wasn't originally. That's good. I'm glad to know that.
Yeah.
Isn't it awesome that someone like a Dennis Prager, like he's got the right understanding, but he doesn't know that the word in Christian tradition and Christian history has not been used as a predictor or a teller of future. It's always been that. And the original in the Greek is that. It never meant something other than what the Hebrew meant.
And he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuseth to let the people go. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning. Lo, he goeth out unto the water. So that's Moses' domain again, the water. And thou shalt stand by the river's brink, against he come. And the rod which was turned to a serpent shalt thou take in thine hand. And thou shalt say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath sent me unto thee, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And so we get that parallelism we talked about yesterday too. It's not just let my people go. It's not into freedom, not in this abstract sense. They're going, because Israelites are the people that wrestle with God. That's what the word means. And let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness, to find their proper place in the structure of being, which is not under your tyranny. And behold, hitherto thou wouldest not hear. Thus saith the Lord, in this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Take thy rod, and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. I have a brief comment there. One of the things I learned from reading the Jungian thinkers was that, and Mircea Eliade was particularly powerful on this motif, was that you can't really distinguish the revenge of nature from the tyranny of the king. Because what happens when your state becomes corrupt and overbearing is that your ability to regulate nature deteriorates in a manner that's commensurate, and so nature rebels. So here's an example. When the hurricane hit New Orleans, you could say, well, that's a natural disaster, right? It's an act of God. But then you could say, well, wait a second. The Dutch built their dikes to withstand one storm, the worst storm in 10,000 years. So when the storm hits the Netherlands, there's no natural disaster. Whereas the Army Corps of Engineers built the dikes to withstand one storm in a century. And so once every 100 years, there's a natural disaster. And then because the state that surrounds New Orleans is corrupt in many ways, not only is the infrastructure not built properly, but it's degenerated because of corruption. And so the rebellion of nature and the corrupt tyranny of the state are in some sense inseparable. And so it seems to me that that's part of the reason why here it's the very water that rebels, is that if the state becomes tyrannical and corrupt enough, then everything is allowed to become polluted in some real sense.
I'm sorry, Jordan. You're just really, really off.
So,
well, I suppose the river and the Nile is as close as you can get to Egypt, or it's the symbol of Egypt. It's the water of Egypt's life being turned to the waters of death.
Right. It's like the water of life.
Right.
And now it's become corrupted.
Well, it's turned to blood to remind them of the Hebrew babies that were drowned there.
Right.
It's a bloody
That's very important. Babies were drowned. Okay.
bloody river.
Yeah.
And isn't each of the plagues is specifically?
He's so on this point. Each of the plagues is a god that the Egyptians are worshipping.
Targeting one of the Egyptian gods, is that right?
Except
So the Nile
10th,
is the river.
Not except the 10th. Prager's wrong on this. Including the 10th, because the 10th is Pharaoh himself, who's the high deity, and his son is his descendant to be the next deity over Egypt. Even the 10th. As a matter of fact, the 10th is the culmination of it.
There's a river god of the Nile, yeah.
And frogs.
How did you find that out? I didn't know that at all.
I just remember this vaguely from freshman year of Jesuit high school.
You guys, did you hear that? How did you figure that out? Reading commentaries, like reading historical data about Egyptian polytheism. I mean, these are very intelligent people. And how did he figure that out? He remembers it from Jesuit high school.
From Jesuit high school.
Those Jesuits, man.
Well, one of the
They know
things
what they're doing, the Jesuits.
one of the important aspects as well that we might miss is the use of the rod. That is, the use of the rod as a symbol of authority. This is
I really hope they don't just run over this. This is so important. As a matter of fact, I'll do something for you guys. It seems to me that they're not gonna go in that direction that I was thinking they would. And so I'll have a little infographic here to show you guys. Because I think if you miss this, by the way, you sort of missed what God is doing. That's how important this is. Joshua said, out of these guys, Jonathan Pageau is the one I resonate with the most. Joshua, I actually don't resonate with Jonathan that much because of his what's the word I'm looking for here? He appeals to mystery quite a bit, and then everything is some kind of a metaphorical thing. And that's why I don't resonate with him. I would say theologically / just like apologetically as well. Os Guinness would be the guy that I resonate with the most. Okay, so I'm going to point these out, and you guys could take a look at these because it's extremely important. So the first one, right? The Nile was the source of Egypt's power. There are several gods in the pantheon that draw life from the river. There's literally multiple gods in the Egyptian pantheon that draw their power from the river Nile. Khnum was the guardian of the river's source. Hapi was the god of the annual flooding of the Nile. Remember, the Nile's banks would flood, and therefore the farming would be able to, that brought about a production of food. And the Lord of the Fish, and it mentions, and we'll go look at the text and you'll see what it says there. Osiris had the Nile as his bloodstream. So you get three gods there, Khnum, Hapi, and Osiris. Okay. That is very, very important given what we're looking at. The fish die. It mentions the fish die, and there's a reason why it mentions the fish die. You can't run away from this. You can't turn this into some kind of a metaphorical thing, guys. You take it for what it says. It has to make sense to the original audience, and the original audience would have looked at this, and the original people experiencing it saying, is the God of the Israelites greater than the gods that draw their source of power from the Nile? And the answer is yes. This is partly why at the end of the entire story, you get a bunch of Egyptians who actually accompany the Israelites and leave Egypt with them. Because through the plagues, these people have actually become converts of believing in the God of the Israelites.
Universal thing. Even Pharaoh has a scepter, the rod, all of this as a manifestation of authority, and you see it in the story as well.
It's the primordial tool, right? A stick. It's the primordial tool,
and it does represent that vertical power, like the manner in which authority descends into the world is through this kind of vertical descent. So the rod represents that. You can imagine, striking the waters, and you'll see Moses use it. Yeah, it is. It is in many ways a magic wand. There are even early images of Christ where they show Christ's miracle where he's holding a staff. And he does his miracles with his staff because it's so ingrained in people's understanding.
Well, why do you need a wand if you're a wizard? You just point out your hand to do your tricks. But no, you have to have a magic wand. And that's a derivative.
It's an externalization of your authority. And that's what the miracle is also, is an externalization of authority. And so the wand becomes a proxy for, it's like, I'm going to act. And then the wand already is an externalization.
Well, if you use a stick, human nervous systems are extremely extendable. And so in some sense, like when you're in an automobile or in an airplane, if you're flying it, then your brain remaps the whole tool to be part of your body. And so we're tool using in the deepest possible sense. And it is definitely the case that the stick is the primordial tool. It's the first spear. It's the first club. It's certainly a thing that you can smack snakes with. And I'm sure, our tree-dwelling relatives cottoned onto that at some point in the extremely distant past. And so the notion that the rod is magic is the same as the notion that the tool is magic, and it's definitely magic. And
then you move on to the Roman, what is it called, fasces? That are the rods of authority, and then you get fascism and authoritarianism.
When the rod can't turn into a snake anymore, or maybe turns into too many snakes.
It's always interesting to me how the icon carver's brain works, because you need something. If God's moving through a person, it's like, well, how do you portray that? If you're making the action figure, what does he look like, right? And there's this amazing conversation, not to get us too far derailed, between Lucas, Kasdan and Spielberg when they were developing Indiana Jones, and the conversation you can find, and they're like, well, he needs a different kind of weapon. What's a weapon no one's had? Like, how about a whip, right? And we need him to have a hat, but the hat should have a personality, it should have a life of its own. And so part of when we're trying to substantiate, when we're trying to make literal the symbolism, it can't just be that God, like if a wizard just points at somebody, well, what's a wizard look like? We need props. The Pharaoh has right? And so this is, of course, something that you are dealing with in your depictions, or else everyone would just look like a Ken doll, right? Everyone would look the same.
Yeah, but
And
I
so
think
you
modern
need-
fiction has actually been very good. Like something like fantasy, like Tolkien, the way they illustrate it, has been very good at making the costumes and the representation of the person as an extension of what they are, so that you see it immediately.
Like Gandalf is such a
Yeah.
striking figure with his staff, and that he can thrust it into the ground with force and cause.
That's how I imagine Moses doing it.
Right. Bang, exactly.
Not like this.
That's
like
what Jonathan,
this.
that's what Jonathan
exactly.
carves too. He just shows up.
I just like.
Okay. Since we're not sponsored by the same sponsors, we're not going to play that portion of the video. I'll use this time to comment on some of the comments that have come in, and then we'll go to that, okay? Hey, what's up, Dave? How you doing, man? Just dropping by. This is so odd that these men are evaluating events that we know didn't happen. Thank you, Barry, since you're all-knowing. And they will all claim to receive interpretation from the Holy Spirit, yet there are disagreements. Barry, you are wrong in like 8 ways in this sentence, but for some reason you thought that it was worthwhile for everyone for you to come in here and make this proclamation. Number one, not everyone sitting here claims to be a Christian, and then they're not going to appeal to they had some kind of a revelation, is what you mean, by the way, that they claim to receive interpretation from the Holy Spirit. Nobody's done that. Maybe you should watch the entire thing before you speak. And there are disagreements because a good amount of them don't know what they're talking about. That's just the reality of it. Like when I'm talking about the actual historical settings for these things. But Barry, in like manner, I guess, you've proven the case for us that you can just make comments and not know what you're talking about. Early church fathers, such as Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, described Exodus as an allegory. And they were wrong, Joshua. Because these individuals thought, their hermeneutic was off. They thought they could allegorize everything. The early church fathers, especially those from Alexandria, and specifically I would say the Eastern fathers as well, as much as I like them, Nyssa, Nazianzus, all those guys, they allegorized quite a bit. And they were wrong. The Bible does not allegorize these stories, internally speaking. One of the best things you can do when it comes to interpretation is see how the text views the text itself. Where in the Bible do we see any of these things being treated as an allegory? Nowhere. 0 places. As a matter of fact, we get hundreds of references to God actively bringing the Israelites out of Egypt as a historical event, which the allegory then becomes nonsense. Because internal evidence shows people's references internal to the Bible, people's references to those stories are not allegorical. Sometimes the Exodus story is used typologically. Okay? So it is a type. And there's a big difference between typology and an allegory. And I'm not going to go into the details of explaining that, but that might be something you might want to look into as something being a type of something else, as opposed to something being an allegory. So whether it's Origen or Nyssa or whomever, I frankly don't care which church father, or which theologian, I shouldn't just say church father. And again, I respect the church fathers and theologians quite a bit, but they're human beings. They could be wrong. They could misapply and misunderstand texts, and then give us really bad understandings. It's the equivalent of me saying, hey, look, here's Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, and he allegorizes the story of the Good Samaritan. He does, and he's wrong. He shouldn't. He's got bad hermeneutics when it comes to that. So we should never have an issue with saying that the church fathers were wrong on, this and that issue, especially when it comes to them like overarchingly allegorizing a text.
Hard. And there's this very powerful image here. It's happened in my own life when I've one of the questions I'm trying to ask myself as I read this is, like, what's happened in my own life when I've hardened my own heart? And there's this very powerful image here, because the river, as James just pointed out, that's the kind of iconic thing about Egypt, that the life is the source of
Nile,
life,
yeah.
the Nile, and it just what's going on here is that Pharaoh hardening his heart is into disordered, you might say, in a wrong relation to what really is. It turns even what is good and beautiful and life giving into a source of death, and it does seem to me that happens in our own lives. When you're out.
Again, this is one of the things that we do in churches quite a bit, and I really don't like it, where we immediately take the text and go, oh, this happens in our lives as well. We take the natural source and good things in our lives and we turn them into. That is true. You don't even need a biblical reference to conclude rationally that there are many good things in our lives we take and we mess up. We worship our kids and we worship our spouses and we worship our jobs. And you don't need biblical evidence to show you that you do this. It's just you can reason through it. It becomes a problem. For some reason, people have this inclination to immediately connect these stories into some kind of a personal life. Just deal with the story the way the story is.
When you're badly out of tune and willful, things start to collapse and invert.
Well, you start to die from the water,
Yes.
from lack of the water of life. There's a famous Grimm's Brother fairy tale that's called The Water of Life, and it's about a king who's old and anachronistic, and he's dying because he doesn't have the water of life. And that's associated mythologically with notions of the search for the Holy Grail too, or the pool in the middle of the forest that revivifies. And water's often used as it's the antithesis of stone. It's the antidote to stone. It's the antithesis to thirst. You thirst in the desert where there's no water, obviously. And
so there's a sense of what you're saying in which what Pharaoh's actually doing is.
Again, look, all of those things could be true. And it could be very well a human thing, like a natural thing of us trying to see us in the text. Yes. But when it comes to proper hermeneutics and proper study and knowing how to interpret anything, by the way, it doesn't matter what we're reading, to know how to interpret those things properly, we have to resist the urge to do that as much as possible and then not to do it. Once we do it, we're going to mess stuff up. Okay? But yeah, that is, as a matter of fact, if you're going to be a good interpreter, especially of the Bible, if you're going to do your hermeneutics properly, you know what your weaknesses are. You should know what are those things that you have biases towards and be aware of them so much where you don't do those things when it comes to studying the text. That's very important.
He's already cutting himself off from the water in a profound sense, and this is a symbol of
remember,
that.
Moses is a master of water. I mean, fundamentally, right? He's symbolized by water all the time, his relationship with water.
Later on he opens up the waters of life from the rock,
Right,
which the people drink.
Well, that's exactly what he's doing with Egypt in some sense. He's releasing the water of life from the rock that contains it. Yeah.
May I just note what you mentioned about freedom, in verse 16, where it's let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. So this link between freedom and service, or even obedience, because the next line, it's thus saith the Lord, in this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. So, to use the distinction of Isaiah Berlin between negative and positive freedom, this is definitely positive freedom. I mean, this is not just freedom from the oppression of the Pharaoh. This is also a life of freedom that is fulfilled in the sense that it is the realization of a particular role,
the highest
particular
role.
Exactly. Yeah.
So true freedom is construed here as service to what is highest. It's not anarchic or chaotic.
And the negative with Berlin is basically the Janis Joplin definition, right? Like freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. It's when you just don't have anything. As opposed to, and it's interesting you said freedom's never used. That word's never used,
But
right?
what's remarkable is
Which
that
is very
the word-
interesting.
The same word for working as slaves is the word for serving the Lord and worship. It's the same word.
Right, so the question then
And the
becomes what
skeptics have
distinguishes
said
them.
the Lord is a despot, and they've shifted from one despot to another. But those, the Anglican prayer book, your service is perfect freedom.
Right.
From the
Incredible
wrong
idea.
kind of worship to the right kind of worship.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's an unbelievably important part of that text.
It should also be told that work is itself worship. This is very important. A lot of Christians miss this. They think that like real ministry is, like working in a church or something like that, like vocationally. Work itself was instituted by God for humanity. It is a part of, like, when people are working, they are acting in the appropriate way that God had designed them to do. Work is worship. Work is ministry. Whether the people are actively aware what they're doing is that or not. And so as a Christian, I would say whatever job it is that you have, you ought to view it as worship unto the Lord. Your service, whatever job that you're doing, by the way, is service to humanity. That's excluding, let's say, like immoral jobs, right? Like there are jobs that would be immoral and wrong. But whatever, say I always give the example of like you're a mechanic or a shoemaker. You are in the work of that, servicing, ministering to other human beings. You're fixing other people's cars. You're providing a service for them. You're fixing shoes for them so that they would be protected from the elements. Their feet would be protected from the elements. That is service. That is ministry. Especially as a Christian, you should view it in that lens. And if you do, trust me, you're going to enjoy the work that you do.
To reiterate that, because we don't ever want to confuse freedom with chaos. They're not the same thing. You know, if you're playing a chess game, you're free to do an almost infinite number of things on the chess game board, but you have to abide by the rules and you have to attempt to win in the proper manner. And I used to play a game with my students in my class, and I'd go up to someone when we were talking about such things and say, okay, do you want to play a game? Some random student, and they'd say yes. And I'd say, okay, you move first. And then they had no idea what to do. It's like, well, and I said, well, you could do anything you wanted. It's like, well, I'm lost. It's like, yeah, that's exactly. When you can do anything you want, you think that's freedom.
You better not ask the wrong student that.
Yeah, I wouldn't ask you. All right. And the magicians
we're now hitting what I consider the funniest verse in the Torah.
All right. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments.
Okay, why is that so funny?
Because there's no more water to turn into blood.
Well, they're doing what Moses did, and they're judging it too.
They're saying to Pharaoh, hey, we can ruin our water supply too. I have always found this to be hilarious. Didn't Pharaoh go, what are you, morons?
Right.
He ruins the water and you can do it too? Yes! Thank you.
And they did the same thing with the gnats.
I gotta say, I'd never seen it like that.
Lice, he says, just to add to it. Yeah.
They can't.
You think,
right.
That is very
Well, they
funny.
also say it's all the water in the land is already turned. So it's like, what are they, like they're seeking out new water to ruin?
They had some water, apparently.
And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. Exodus 8. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come up both on thee, and upon thy people, and upon all thy servants. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians
kids in Jewish life sing the following song.
By the way, just going back to this. Okay, so we're in Exodus 8, 1-5. The Egyptians also produced frogs. Piles of dead frogs filled the land with a foul odor. Hecht was an Egyptian goddess with the head of a frog. Hecht. Now that's the second one we get.
There were one morning when Pharaoh woke in his bed, there were frogs on his head and frogs in his bed, frogs on his nose and frogs on his toes, frogs here, frogs there, frogs were jumping everywhere.
Well, this is a kind of comical plague.
Exactly, certainly, but the point that I love about that is the only reason these kids know about Pharaoh is because of the frogs. The king, the demigod of Egypt, is known to Jewish children thousands of years later because of frogs.
Do you think there's a transition here? So we have water first, but then frogs live halfway on water and halfway on land, right? Yeah. They're this mediating creature. And, you know, the tribe of native Canadians that I am associated with, they regard the frog as a weather vane of nature in some sense, too, because frogs are extremely sensitive to environmental degradation. Yeah. And so they're the amphibian equivalent of canaries in the coal mine.
So what you'll see now in the plagues is you're going to see something like this. You're going to see something like death coming from below and getting higher and higher. And so it starts with just the water, which is turned into blood, and now from
blood, and then fish die. Fish die.
the water come these frogs. And then later you'll see from the dust comes the lice, and then the livestock, and then it's going to continue. We'll talk about it when we get there. So what you're seeing is basically the undoing of creation.
That is a really good observation, that like the death kind of multiplies. It gets more serious and serious, and gets closer to human beings, I guess, in the sense of like the animal life. You go fish and then frogs, and then you're getting more serious stuff dying.
You can understand it that way. That is, creation is this union of heaven and earth, and now there's like there's going to be an undoing, where at first you're going to see the revolution of the earth from above, and then you're going to see a kind of oppression and hostility in aerial phenomena.
Okay, so Oz's point that was very interesting is that this great land of monuments were undone by gnats. And also it's like, what's the animal most associated with the pharaoh, right, is a snake, right? And snakes eat frogs. And so like there's something that's very amusing with this, you know, Mel Brooks.
And he's on the right note here, except, yeah, frogs are worshipped, and God has control over frogs.
Nothing can stand up to humor. That's why he made fun of Hitler.
Or not frogs, but they have a deity that is associated with the frog that is worshipped.
Right. Nothing stands up to humor. It's a very funny image to have this pharaoh with his grand, like, cobra decor being undone with frogs that a children's nursery can mock. And there's also, there's an Egyptian god who's associated with frogs, which I think you should know of all people.
I have a little statue.
Right.
It's Kek.
Yes.
That's right, Kek. Yeah.
And so it's
that all
another...
came up with the whole Pepe thing, too.
Yeah,
That's right.
Just saying the pronunciations, so he says Kekt. That might be the way you pronounce it. Usually in some translations from Armenian, like H's sometimes are seen as a but is it Kekt, I think?
Yeah, it's Kek.
Yes.
That's right, Kek. Yeah,
and so it's
that all
another...
came up with the whole Pepe thing, too.
Yeah,
that's right.
So the Pepe thing is funny in this context, in the sense of the amphibian. For sure, the Church Father, St. Gregory of Nyssa, who I'm going to keep bringing up, sorry. So he really talks about the amphibious nature of the frogs as being important, because it has to do with the undoing. So the undoing in that which has a hybrid identity, in that which has an ambiguous identity. And so the frogs appear as, they really are monsters, because they live both above and below. So they kind of set, the image of the frogs become like an image of this undoing, where identities are breaking down.
Right, because they're like a psychopomp in some sense. They inhabit both places, and the frogs are fine if there's not too many of them. But when the confused identity frogs are everywhere, then you have real trouble.
Yeah, you're not supposed to have frogs in your house. They're in the water and on the frog. But if you have frogs in your house, frogs in your bread, yeah, that's right.
Too many frogs.
That's a lot of ambiguity. Too much ambiguity.
Important point to add. You're right about the anti-creation and the destruction, but only the Lord can restore.
That's right.
He does every time. And it's the same thing with tyrants can destroy, and they do, but they can't rebuild. And that's very clear from that.
I like this theme of negative creation, as kind of the unraveling of creation, Jonathan, decreation. And I think actually we're licensed to draw that interpretation. If you look at, is it verse 25? It's just the last verse. And 7 days were fulfilled. After that, the Lord had smitten the river. So it's as if and that doesn't come elsewhere in any of the other plagues. So it's almost as if we're being invited to
understand it in relationship to the creation.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, and it is a very common mythological motif that when order falls apart, what you do see is a reversion to the potential that existed at the beginning of time. Those are the same thing, right? When order deteriorates, then you get a return, an undoing, and a...
By the way, you see the same thing when it comes to Noah and the flood story. That human beings have gotten so evil, and there's a destruction of everything, and then there's a recreation of things. And the way we know that is that God essentially comes up with a new covenant with Noah and his descendants. And that's very closely aligned to the covenant that there was there with Adam and Eve. So very, like, if you look at the parallels in regards to covenantal relationships between those two things, it's amazing.
Return to pre-cosmogonic chaos. And it's out of that new order can emerge.
And you also have to be careful. Even during the flood, we tend to think of the flood just as the water, but that's not what's going on. There's the water and the heavens, and it's the separation of the two which undoes the world. So we think of the flood just as the water, but you can think of the image of just water and just heaven and nothing alive in between. And so I think this is what we're going to see as we notice the first plagues going like this, and then all of a sudden it moves up, and then everything goes crazy above.
So is the construction of the tabernacle as a place where heaven and earth meet? Then of course,
And so the tabernacle is the proper resting place of God, and also in some sense that which shields God from the careless view of human beings, the too careless view of human beings.
And the tabernacle is an encapsulation of creation.
That's right. It's a microcosm of the world. Definitely.
Okay. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers. and over the ponds, and caused frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron did so, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt.
This is just laughing.
Yeah, same thing
silently.
again. Yeah, it's like, here's some more frogs. We can do it too. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, I guess he's had it because he's up to his neck in frogs. It's like, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto
This
the
is where
Lord.
he lies.
And Moses said unto Pharaoh, glory over me. When shall I entreat for thee and for thy servants and for thy people to destroy the frogs from thee and thy houses, that they may remain in the river only? And he said, tomorrow. And he said, be it according to thy word, that thou may knowest that there are none like unto the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from thee.
By the way,
and
those
from thy
are the
houses
key
back to
statements.
ward.
Like,
Yeah.
we
And
really
from thy
get
servants. So as soon as the tyrant bows to the will of God,
we really get into the motivation here. It's like, let it be like that. Let it be whatever you're saying, so that you would know that there's no one like the Lord. So within it is given this wonderful statement of, this is being done so that you guys would know there's no one like God.
then the ambivalent monsters depart. And from thy people, they shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh. And Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, and out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart and hearkened not unto them,
hardened his own
as the
heart.
Lord had said. That's another place, Stephen, where you can think about how that works in your own life. It's like, you repent, you get away with it, you think, I got away with it, I can do it again. It's like, and the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, so that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Yeah, and so then they're longing for the days of frogs. And they
On
did
the
so.
third plague of each set of three, forgetting the 10th is totally separate, they don't warn Pharaoh.
That's a
Just
good,
a
wow.
pattern that
So that's a very interesting literary observation there. So on the third one, the Pharaoh is not warned. Very interesting.
Well, the first
that it
one's
is.
in the morning bathe, isn't it?
That's also
And the
also a
second
pattern.
one comes
That's right.
from the palace. Third one,
There
no warning.
are a lot of patterns in the plagues.
It's very carefully constructed.
I wonder why it's the third time there's no warning.
I love. He's like, let me see these archetypes. 3, 3, 3.
Well, I guess you've been warned twice.
Right, you're warned
You're warned
twice.
twice. That's
and then
fair,
we'll,
right? I
and
warned
then,
you twice.
Right, exactly. And then we'll start it over again.
It's what's established to create a pattern that one can anticipate, right? That's how jokes work, right? You need the first two, and you anticipate the pattern, then you subvert it. So it's in some ways it's giving the Pharaoh fair chance,
Right.
With two,
Right. But it also adds an anomalous twist to the new threat because it's not predictable. Because now you think, well, I'm going to be warned about this. It's like, no,
You
you're
had two
lulled into a
chances.
false sense of security.
But there's another point in what you read, and that is the educational purpose of the plagues. In other words, they're obviously a question of power, and they're obviously a question of
So
judgment,
that you would know there's no one like the Lord.
as you were saying about the river of blood. But, that you may know that there's no one like the Lord. And the whole 10 is to show Pharaoh he's not God.
Right. Right.
That comes very
part of the
strongly,
point
that
there, too, is that
demonstrative
Pharaoh's such a tyrant that it takes 10 plagues before
to
he...
get to him.
Yeah.
It's to show the Israelites too. Oh, forgive me. It's a very big theme here.
Good point.
And it's written in. I don't like to read into text. It's written in that it will be known that I am God. I have defeated all the gods of Egypt. But it is as much a message to the Israelites as it is to Pharaoh.
So let me break that down here. This is very important. Very good point by Dennis Prager. Because the Israelites who have been living in the land of Egypt for 400 years have probably, and I think we see this very clearly in the text, we'll see it later on with the story of the golden calf, taken on viewpoints, presuppositions, worldview from the Egyptians. Meaning that even though they've been in the land, and to a certain extent, at a certain point in that time they're in the land, they've been slaves. They believe and think like Egyptians. And so when they're out of the desert, the first opportunity to get to do something, they do exactly what they would have done in Egypt. They create a image to represent the God that brought them out of Egypt. The golden calf story is not them worshiping another god. the golden calf story is them creating an image of Yahweh and saying, because Aaron says this to the people, here's your God who brought you out of Egypt. So they are so much thinking like the Egyptians, or they're so much like an Egyptian because they've been there for 400 years. I mean, just think about people groups who live in certain countries who aren't native to those places for 400 years and then how that affects them. As an immigrant to the United States, as someone who came here when I was 11 years old, I'm very much an American, the way I process information and think. And I see that even more when I'm actually in Armenia. So it is for them to learn. It is for the people of Israel to learn about God as well.
Yeah, it's saying that Pharaoh, not just that Pharaoh is no longer is not God, but also that he's no longer Pharaoh, that he's no longer king over Egypt, that God has total control over all of the gods of Egypt.
And it is to say that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God owns everything, and we get that in the beginning verses of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. How would there be other gods where in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? He created everything.
Everything that gives Egypt life, that makes it tick.
Did you ever?
Okay. Oops. Where are we? There we are. I don't want to get in trouble.
Continually emphasizing the principle of reality itself, right, is that even if you're tyrannical and even if you have all the power there is, if you violate the heavenly order, everything will go to hell.
Yeah,
and
the God of
repeatedly.
Genesis, that's right. It's the God of Genesis, as it were, re-revealing himself, but in negative terms, as it were. That's having total control over the natural order and transcending it completely.
And Israel, right, that's Jacob's name, right, is Israel? Meaning those who struggle with God. What's interesting is it's not a tyrannical rule. Despite the power, you're allowed to struggle. You're allowed, if you're Moses, you're allowed to say,
and you have free will too.
Well, Moses goes back and forth with God a lot, as we've been observing. There's a lot of movement and negotiation with their faith to come to understand God, to come to understand their role, to not want to heed the calling. There's room that's built in that isn't evidenced in the Pharaoh.
So that's the qualitative distinction in some sense between servitude in Egypt and the servitude of God in the wilderness, is that although it's both subordination in some sense to a structure of power, the manner in which the power manifests itself is completely different.
And what happens when you negotiate with Pharaoh? He says, no, now get your own straw to make a brick.
Right. He just doubles down. Right.
Whereas God's pretty patient with Moses. He's like, all right, we'll give you Aaron. Like, I'll explain. I'll be there.
Right. And the other thing too is that God wants voluntary assent. Right, which is the opposite of the tyrant.
Which is the struggling.
Complete opposite of the tyrant. Yeah.
I love the Jewish notion of argument on behalf of heaven. And it's a great notion. You can argue with the Lord, Abraham at Sodom or Job. You can argue with the Lord if you're arguing on behalf of his creation. That's a magnificent tradition, I think.
Yes, we learned that early on. That's right. By the way, it's in light. I feel silly commenting on my own comments, but in light of this notion that this will make an impression on Israel as well as on Egypt, I've smitten all their gods and the Pharaoh. One of the great lessons, in my opinion, is that miracles don't work. People think, I know this from decades of talking to people on the radio. And
this is a very, very good point. I don't know I think I know what he's going to say. And I think here's what he's going to say. Some people think only if you witnessed a miracle, you would come to believe in God. Right? Or you would submit yourself to God, not necessarily believe in God. That's not necessarily the case. Remember, there was people who were involved in the crucifixion of Jesus who never came to believe. And they saw the evidence for the resurrection who never came to believe. And I'm not necessarily going to say that miracles don't work, but to the assumption that people think if you witness a miracle, therefore you become a believer, that is just not true. And I know in the evangelical circles, there's a lot of people who think that's all someone needs. They just got to experience God. Only if they experience God, only if they saw the power of God and the work of God, they're going to come to believe. That's not necessarily true.
speeches that, if only God did X, Y, or Z. As Woody Allen said, if he just sneezed, I would believe in him. But it's not true.
No.
Miracles do not produce faith.
No.
It's one of the most important things for every modern person to know. There are many reasons to believe in God, but a miracle won't change your mind. And
Well, it could.
if, like many of us, you believe that all of life is a miracle. Our talking here, the birth of the birth, not just of a human child, the birth of an ant. If you don't see that as a miracle, then why will you see split seas as a miracle?
Well, and Moses is obviously capable of seeing a miracle because he turns to look at the burning bush.
That's right. That's right. That's why that was an important part. That's right. Well said. Yes.
And there's knock-on effects both ways, right? I mean, in Moses' case, let's say the incipient moral principle of slaying the Egyptian, even if he's kind of cowardly about it, to having the sensitivity of heart to turn away to see the bush, which then the burning bush then leads to the encounter with God, that then leads. So too with Pharaoh, he hardens his heart the first time, he hardens the second time. I think this happens in our own lives. Like, it's not just the things you've been warned about that your hardness of heart causes you trouble on, but they have knock-on effects too. And so then you do this wrong, and then, oh gosh, and that too. And so I think that there was this third thing of not being warned. It's this sense that you get into the train of this. It's like, no. It's way worse than you think.
Right. You've already set something in motion.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and there's also a gospel story that I can't bring to mind right now where Christ says there's a servant who's been warned not to misbehave and knows not to and misbehaves anyways. And there's another servant who does the same thing, but in ignorance, and Christ says to him that because you knew, your punishment is going to be much harsher. And so you've been warned twice and you didn't listen, and so now something else is going to happen to you. And that's deserved because you were in fact warned and you didn't listen. And I saw this in my clinical practice very, very frequently, that, my clients would be ignorant about something and be punished for it. But then when they woke up and realized what they were doing and still did it, the punishment was redoubled. So
that's like in Catholic absolution, right? In confession, you're not allowed to sin with the notion you can absolve yourself of it later, right? You can't premeditatedly sin and know you have an out.
Right, that's not an escape.
No.
In fact, that's worse. Yeah.
Well, this is jumping ahead a bit, but there's, I think, a difference between Pharaoh recognizing that he's, the God of the Hebrews is against him, and then wanting to try and remedy that, and then a genuine show of penitence later on. I think it's just before the killing of the firstborn, where he actually repents. He says he expresses sorrow, and it's almost as if that 10th plague, which is just probably the most horrific of them all, is is such a serious punishment because his sorrow, his awareness, his conscience is really awakened at that point. I mean, it's beginning to be here, but it's still quite instrumental. He realizes something's wrong, and he knows that he can fix it.
It may also be that by the 9th plague, it's just too late, right? Even if you do repent at that point, it's like, yeah, but still, the process has been set in motion. And that's what did Nietzsche say? You might think you're done with the past, but that doesn't mean the past thinks it's done with you. And that's like...
By the way, you've made me rethink Nietzsche. I just wanted you to know, he had a lot of profound things to say.
Oh, yeah. He's something.
I assume he has such a bad name because the Nazis liked him. I mean, why does he have such a bad name?
His sister warped a lot of his writing, and then there were derivatives of it that were used by the Nazis to justify their actions. But Nietzsche's philosophy is he had an absolute horror of absolutist states, and that's crystal clear. And so,
and the consequences of the death of God.
Oh yes, and there's no one more prophetic about that except maybe Dostoevsky.
And he always spoke very highly of you, Dennis.
Thank you. I didn't want to say.
Before you go and pick up Dennis's point, I agree with you totally. And Jesus makes roughly the same point. When in the parable someone says, send someone down to my relatives, and he says, no, even if they see a resurrection from the dead, they won't believe.
Right.
You're absolutely
right.
Exactly. But what you have here, you have words, and there's a lot of words. But words are vital, but not enough. And then you have these power wonders, and the two together, and they're not enough. And eventually it has to be the 10th one that does it. But I wanted to raise the question for all of us at the end, maybe. What are the lessons for this? For our confronting what's today a system and a spirit that is all embracing. In other words, so often we are just words. And clearly words alone for Moses, not enough.
Or for the Pharaoh.
No,
well, and there's a negative miracle aspect here too. It might be that people are less convinced about positive miracles, but if something negative enough happens to you, that's outside your realm of expectation, sometimes that can actually wake you up.
You have an example?
Just Solzhenitsyn?
Death or a catastrophe in your life.
I see. Oh, that's it. But the people see that as a miracle, though.
Well,
See,
That's a good question. You know. We tend to think of a miracle as only something positive, but these
that's
plagues are obviously
fascinating.
miracles.
That's right. I like that. That's
So,
fascinating.
and it's a lot more difficult to deny a negative miracle. Yeah.
I've never thought of that. Am I happy I came?
Yeah, there's nothing happier than a negative miracle, man.
I always think about Solzhenitsyn in that regard, of like where he was to have his epiphany, right? He was like the least empowered human being. I mean, he had testicular cancer in a gulag. Like there was, you can't.
Weeks.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where he had an awakening.
Yeah,
Or you think about
too.
Mandela, right?
I think the negative miracle problem, you've really transfixed me here.
This is essentially the idea that God is intervening and acting upon a situation in a way where it is negatively impacting you. Just to not confuse people when it comes to negative miracles. But it's God's activity in the world.
It leads to a different issue for me. God's existence to me is so rationally compelling that I don't even understand atheism. But I think God's goodness is a leap of faith, not God's existence.
Right. But I think it's the leap of faith, because
It
in
is
some
the
sense
leap of
what you
faith.
do is...
I don't think so. So I think you can rationally conclude that if there is a God, that God would have to be a good God. If we go in the direction of the greatest conceivable being, something like an Anselmian deduction, right? Like, so if Anselm of Canterbury is right, that God is the greatest possible being to exist, or the greatest conceivable being to exist, goodness would have to be a part of that, because goodness at self-value, it's self-evident that goodness is a better thing than not goodness, evilness, or badness. And so therefore it would be that if God is the greatest conceivable being, therefore this God would have to be a good God. And so therefore this God would be worthy of worship. That's the way this would break down. Think about that, guys. Pause it, think about it. Come back to it when you're done with the stream. Mark minute, whatever, 1 hour and 12 minutes into this, and think about it clearly.
You decide that things are good, and you're going to act in the service of the good in many ways, despite the evidence.
Yes.
Right. So that's why it's an act of faith. It's like, well, yeah, you can understand arguments for nihilism and despair, especially if you meet people who've been brutalized beyond belief. But then now and then you meet someone who's been brutalized beyond belief, and instead of being corrupt and nihilistic, they've pulled out of that a goodness that's so deep that it's miraculous. And you meet people like that pretty damn often. And they've decided, despite all this, and sometimes that's so brutal you can't even listen to it, despite all this, I do believe that things are good, and I will serve the good. And that's faith.
Yes, but they're not, in those cases, they're rarely doing so without their own evidence. I mean, they're precisely the people who are able to illuminate to you, the abiding underlying goodness, because they're actually connected with it. It's not, doing this in a vacuum.
People usually, it's maybe associated with the burning bush idea. I mean, I'm thinking of an artist that I've worked with for a long time who was brutalized beyond belief when he was young. And he found his salvation through beauty. And so it was like the burning bush. He noticed that despite how catastrophic his life had been and how tyrannized he was in the most fundamental sense, beauty beckoned to him, and he heeded the call, and it completely transformed his life and his character, his career, everything.
Right. So it's not as if it's simply against the evidence. I mean, there is.
Right. But he was. Yeah, that's so interesting too, because he was still, despite all that, he was still open to the possibility that there might be something beyond the catastrophe. Right.
But isn't part of the answer what we were saying yesterday in the nature of God? You don't come to discover him abstractly. He's, I will be who I will be. In my actions, delivering you, caring for you, you come to know he's good. There is evidence, as Stephen is saying. Sure, isn't that the answer, Dennis, to what you're saying? We don't say he's good because it's theology principle number 15 or whatever.
but because, finish.
Because we've seen the goodness of God in his actions in history or in our own individual lives or whatever.
Well, it would seem to be a hard argument to make to a concentration camp survivor, that he has seen predominantly the goodness of God. However, having said that, there is an interesting book written long ago about the theology of concentration camp survivors, and it found that, and I don't claim that this is absolutely correct, but I'm just telling you what it reported, and it seemed to me to make sense, that the percentage of Jews who went through the death camps, and I specifically mentioned death camps, who came out, the proportions of atheists and believers was the same. Many switched. Atheists became believers and believers became, but the proportion remained virtually identical.
Interesting.
So there were people who have only good in their life, relatively speaking, who don't believe in God. So I'm challenging my own question because I've wrestled with this, because I think the hardest law in the 613 laws of the Torah is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. I long believe that's the hardest. I have no problem trying to
Unless
obey
to
God.
throw yourself into existence fully as if it's good.
Yes,
and that's a rough one because...
So I would just say, reflecting back on the Psalms, when individuals are going through very hard times, just because Dennis is talking about a Jewish historical example when it comes to the Holocaust. And as an Armenian, I can talk about the genocide and folks going through the genocide and various views about God and what that did to them. I don't want to get caught in that, but I would say this. When you read the Psalms, it's very, very obvious that the psalmist will say stuff like, Lord, you are faithful because you brought us out of Egypt. So there's a rough time, there's a rough patch in the person's life, and they reflect on this other time where God was faithful. And then they say, because of that, I trust in your goodness now.
Jeez,
right.
Look at it. It's pretty rough.
That's
man.
right. That's right.
So Solzhenitsyn was struck in the concentration camps by goodness, though, constantly. And it was out of that seed of the observation of goodness that the whole Gulag archipelago emerged, and therefore, in no small part, the fall of the Soviet Union.
That's a prophet. Solzhenitsyn is a prophet.
Yeah, and he said that he really noticed particularly, and he was atheistic when he went into the camps, that the devout religious believers were able to maintain their moral integrity in camp.
And physical.
Often, yes,
Yeah.
not always, because he said, no, let's not push this. Sometimes people just got shot.
Yeah.
But he saw people, and he tells very compelling stories of people who thrived and became healthier in the face of the privation under the ultimate moral authority of their own shining soul.
Wow.
And the stories in the Gulag, especially in Volume 2, they're unbelievably compelling. And Frankl said similar things. And Solzhenitsyn was particularly careful not to say, that doesn't mean I'm saying that everyone who failed because of their moral flaws, or that purity of heart would necessarily save you. You know, he's a complex thinker, but...
That's one of the miracles I think he saw when I was talking about him earlier, because he talked about how some people were hardy and robust. Yeah. And he was careful to say, it's not like you can secret your way to health in a gulag, right? He wasn't being flippant about it. But he was noticing that some people who had
and they wouldn't
more
cooperate.
resources...
They wouldn't cooperate with the
they were
Gulag
unbroken.
authorities.
Yeah.
They would never become trustees. And they tell the...
It was Cool Hand Luke.
Yeah.
It's also the epistemic humility, though. The difference between the presumption that you know all there is and it's bad, and you're saying, I don't have it all. I mean, you think those last words that Job says at the very end of the book of Job, therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful me, which I knew not.
That's right.
At the end of it all saying, I didn't actually understand the whole picture.
Well, it's also hope in that, because one of the things is that if you're suffering terribly, there's two options in front of you in some sense. One is you're suffering terribly and it's unjust, and you're suffering terribly because the cosmos itself is flawed in its fundamental structure. And that's really Cain's complaint against God. The other possibility is you're suffering at least in part because you're not everything you could be. And that's a terrible burden to take onto yourself because it's the burden of your own suffering. But it's also unbelievably hopeful because it could be that, I think maybe Frankl recounts that story. I don't remember where I read it. A woman who visited a psychiatrist and who said to the psychiatrist, I really hope there's something wrong with me. And the psychiatrist said, why? And she said, well, if there's something wrong with me, there's hope because I might be able to fix it. But if there's something wrong with the structure of existence, so I'm fated to suffer in this way, then everything's despair. And the people that I have seen who've transcended their tragedy and malevolence that have pursued them, they did have that sense of their own ignorance, even with regards to the conclusions they drew about their suffering.
And Frankl himself has this very odd story at the end of the book, where after this array of unspeakable horrors, he then talks about this particularly sadistic, brutal figure whom he'd known from some clinic, the Stein whatever, in Vienna or something. And then he says that he heard a story that this man, this concentration camp figure, had been sent off to a Russian camp at the end of the war, and then heard from another colleague that this brutal figure had actually been extremely humane and supportive as an inmate of a Soviet camp. And it's that very enigmatic ending of Frankl's book where it's almost as if to say, even where you're convinced that there's evil that's irredeemable,
Right.
that maybe there's a
still
possibility.
hope,
Yes,
hope
yes.
for redemption.
I know that's a bit. It seems like a bit, but it
No,
is.
no,
It's very possibly
Why do you think
possible.
why is that idea considered so dangerous?
What idea?
This idea that, because even when
Because
you
we want it to be.
well,
we want it to be.
immediately goes into blaming the victim. Like you even went to pains to say he wasn't saying that anybody could, right, through the inner light of their soul, come out positively in a gulag. But there's such a resistance against this notion. It's like it's almost outside the Overton window to say you can alleviate some of your own suffering by your orientation towards the world. It's almost considered a dangerous proposition now, and we have to go to pains to make caveats about it when we even mention it.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky business. When my daughter was young and she was really ill, I told her when she was very young, I said to her, don't you use your illness as an excuse, ever. Because you'll confuse yourself, then you won't know what you can do. You're going to have a hard time doing things. But if you use your illness as an excuse, if you corrupt yourself morally, which you have in some sense every right to do because of the depth of your suffering, and which would be perfectly understandable under the circumstances, it will do nothing at all but make the situation far worse.
Yeah, it's true.
So,
The boundary between sin and syndrome has got more and more blurred. The idea that moral failure can become so easily pathologized, and in pathologizing it, we risk fixing it. It becomes a sort of part of who we are, as opposed to something that we can be redeemed from, that we can confess and repent from.
We also moves to possession. Jonathan and I were discussing this a little bit with this, mental health pandemic that we're seeing all around us, but particularly in teenagers, where it's you have depression, you have anxiety, rather than you're in a healing crisis. Right, there's a beginning, a middle, and end. It doesn't mean you won't have another one and another one, but you're at least oriented in some ritualistic meaning to integrate into incorporate.
The illness isn't an ingredient in your identity. It's something that you can, in principle.
And you're going to blow out at your weak points always. It can happen again and again. Life is a series of hero quests and healing crises. But we tend to talk about, we must remove this, right?
Well, you can degenerate, I suppose, into what happens to Job, is he's cursed by God in some real sense, or by Satan at least, and then he's sick to death and scraping his wounds with potsherds by the fire, and then his friends come along and say, well, obviously you did something to deserve this, which is often the case for sick people, right? It's not only are they sick, but everybody thinks, well, if you would have just behaved better, it's like, and so that's part of the problem, right? Is that, and I guess that's why it's so important to so carefully separate the wheat from the chaff. It's like, well, we found this a lot when dealing with my daughter when she was so sick, because, for example, if she wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, it's like, well, what do you do about that? Do you attribute it to the illness? Do you blame it to the illness? Do you let her off the hook? And the answer is, you pay as much attention as you possibly can. So she moves ahead as much as she can, but no more. And that judgment is so difficult to make, especially with someone who's ill.
And maybe that's part of our scattered attention and focus right now, right? I mean, if everything moved from, texts to blogs.
We've left the text, by the way, just putting that out there. We're talking about suffering and so on. So great discussion and conversation, which is fine.
Posts to tweets to Instagram, right? Like our attention is so focused that maybe that's part of the process of collapsing the space you said between sin and syndrome, because it's not that complicated in some ways, to have that sort of conversation with somebody. Like
right,
a conversation
but it has to be personal, right?
Well, and you have to really slow down and take time in the morning to say, okay, what's going on? Can you really not get out of bed?
Syndrome. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, okay, you can't get out of bed. Great. We'll try tomorrow. Or, it's a very delicate proposition, because you're dealing with people's vulnerabilities. And if you get it wrong.
Well, and you also have to help them test it. So I remember one time we were going to buy her a scooter so she could get around. And so she had to go and take motorcycle lessons, and somebody crashed the motorcycle a bit at one of the lessons, and she woke up in the morning and she was afraid to go. And no wonder, she just had a hip replacement. So she was on like a motorbike 3 weeks later. And so it was risky, but we thought, man, this kid's got to be able to move around. And she was afraid to go. And so her mother said to her, why don't you just get out of bed and come with me in the car? And then when you get there, you can see if you can do this or not, and maybe you can't. And then, well, when she got there, and so that was that judicious pushing. Is it sin or syndrome? Well, it's no wonder you're afraid. And so we think we're crazy in some sense. Like, you just had your hip replaced. Now we're putting you on a motorbike. That's a big risk. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe you're right to be afraid. And so then you test it, right? That's collaborative empiricism. That's what the behaviorists call it. It's like, well, maybe this is the right way forward. Why don't we go out and test it a little bit?
Well, it takes an incredible amount of empathy without falling into complete empathy. Right, because you have to be aware if someone says, no, I have different limitations than you, Dad, right?
Yeah.
I actually can't do that, and maybe you could now or when you were my age, but it's being incredibly attuned to the differences without falling into the...
That's pretty good advice for parents, by the way.
Ease of 100% empathy solves all problems.
But also, I think we need to be careful not to confuse these things. There's no we don't have to deny that there are victims and injustices or anything else to say that it's always good to be open to what you don't understand or what is beyond you, or to be open to the burning bush in your own life. So
especially then.
They don't have to be in any way confused. I mean, it's an absolute, no matter what you're going through. that
That
there's
rigidity,
more than you see.
and rigidity is the enemy, always.
But that's especially the case with God, that we're so tempted to think in anthropomorphic terms about God as a moral agent, that is to say, as a member of our moral community, and to evaluate him as if we would evaluate the Pharaoh. I think that's why, Stephen quoting the last verse of Job, that's a brilliant observation, I think, that God is the source of all goodness. In the classical theistic tradition,
Right.
he's identical with goodness.
Well, then,
he's that in virtue of which any good action
In the Christian sense, by the way.
is a good action.
Well, it also means that if the victim is only construing himself or herself as a victim and everyone else is doing that, you're also in some sense saying to them that there is no pathway forward
That's right.
through this, right?
Yeah.
There is no possibility of the miraculous revelation. And that the miraculous revelation might not even be a cure. It might be that if you could see what's beckoning properly, at least while you're dying, you'd have this love and support around you that you need, so that isn't utter hell, right?
Well, it's also the shame motif we're talking about. Moses hid his face, it's Adam and Eve, because if you can get to the place that you're not a hapless victim in the face of the injustices of the universe objectively, and there is a part that has to do with you, that's going to produce shame. And you have to be strong enough to get through shame to see and confront the burning bush and be transformational. I was struck so much in reading Exodus, how much of that is a recurring motif.
I just want to add when I explain to people the fundamental difference between a religious education, Jewish or Christian, and a secular education in our time, I say it this way. I was raised, the biggest problem in Dennis Prager's life is Dennis Prager.
Right.
In secular schools, in our time, the greatest problem in your life is America, racism, sexism, homophobia, your parents, never you. Always something outside
This
of
is
you.
a very, very good
And that
observation.
dichotomy...
It destroys your agency.
It totally.
Completely. Well, and that's the point in some real sense.
It's an incredible thing because it destroys you and the society.
Right.
It's disempowering, to coin a word.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, right.
To coin, right.
All right, so, and the magicians did so
Back
with
to
their
the text.
enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And
Notice they don't sit there and say, man, I wonder what the archetypal relationship between gnats and staffs are. That's not what the original audience does. The original audience, the magicians, say, this is God. And but we can't do anything beyond this, man. This is God. That's a fulfillment of what God said. I'm doing these things so that you guys would know that I am the Lord. Internally, the text interprets itself more often than not if you pay close attention.
he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water. So we're in the next cycle, right? The beginning of the next cycle. And say unto him, thus saith the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee. And
So I think there we are. So we get gnats or lice came up from the dust of the earth. The Egyptian priests could not duplicate this miracle. They declared this is the finger of God. Geb or Jeb was the god over the dust of the earth or the earth. Then we're going to move into flies over here. Khepri had the head of a beetle and also moved the sun. I'm just going to go through these one by one. Okay.
upon thy servants and upon thy people and into thy houses. It's another humiliation, real humiliation there of the Pharaoh. And the houses of Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou may knowest.
So the
that I am
flies are like limited to Goshen. Like they don't infect Goshen.
the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And the Lord did so. And there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses and into all of the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, it is not meet, it is not right, so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? We will go 3 journeys into the wilderness, and sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he shall command us. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. Now, the abomination of the Egyptians, if I remember correctly, the Egyptians held cows as sacred. It's something like that. The Hebrews were going to sacrifice something that the Egyptians would regard as appalling to sacrifice, right, as sacred. Exactly. And so Moses basically objects when the Pharaoh says, well, you can do it here in Egypt. Moses says, no, we can't do it because the Egyptians will be very upset with us. We have to go away from them to do this. So that's what that abomination of the Egyptians means.
The Paschal sacrifice is a god of Egypt.
Right. Okay. So that's really the crucial issue there. Right. Okay. So they're sacrificing the god of.
By the way, this is exactly the point that I was making in regards to they're so indoctrinated by Egyptian thinking, where when they're out of Egypt, they come up with a golden calf to represent Yahweh. So they find a sacred thing that's been a part of their upbringing, and then they... Right, and notice here, this is a conversation that we're just having. Hathor was a fertility goddess who was often depicted with the head of horns of a bull, and sometimes as a bull wearing the symbols of Hathor.
The Egyptians, it's no wonder the Egyptians are upset about that. So, and Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far away, for obvious reasons. Entreat for me. And Moses said, Behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord did, according to the word of Moses. And he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also. Neither would he let the people go. Great, we're cruising today. Exodus 9. Anything to say about the flies specifically? It's part of this transition?
Yeah, so I think you'll see, so it's moving up, right? So you have got the frogs, this ambiguous, and you've got the lice, and you've got the flies, and then the next plague, you're going to see a transition, which actually is kind of it's actually an anti-burning bush, by the way, where, well, we'll read it, and then we can talk about it later.
Okay. Okay, so we're moving up the heavenly hierarchy in some sense.
That's right, but like a weird upside down, like a breaking apart of creation through this.
It's also interesting, though, the way this just in a way, it's just a fly, right? There's a lot of them.
But it's quantity too.
But there's something about
right. The quantity has to do with the earth. That's what the earth is, right? So you have quality above and you have quantity below. And so when quantity invades, right? When you think about it like you could think about it like you have a nation, and then you have the swarms of barbarians that come in, and the quantity just overruns the quality. Right? There's always more outside than there is inside.
So is that the multiplicity overriding the unity?
That's what it is. And that's why it's multiple. It's like you're drowning in frogs, you're drowning in lice, you've got swarms of flies. It's quantity that is overtaking the identity of the Egyptian.
And it's a small thing, right? I mean, it's a lot of these little things, our sins are like that. But a lot of the little ones, it adds up. But I just want to quickly draw attention to verse 28, where I'll let you go that you may sacrifice the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far. Entreat for me. And there's this whole sense that you were talking about, Jonathan, about the instrumentalization of the Hebrews. And there's this sense like, well, okay, I'll let you sort of pay attention to the transcendent, but only on my terms. So it's this sense of he's refusing to relinquish. Even the relinquishing is on terms that are not relinquishing. And I think there's a profound sense in which he's absolutely not bowing to the principle, even when he says he is. He's like, well, not really.
Yeah. When we talk about this kind of divine balance, it's interesting. Jordan and I talk a lot about the big five personality traits as they equate to political orientation, right? High trait openness, right, tends to be more liberal, right? And it's very interesting because when either one is unchecked, right? If it's conservatism unchecked tends to go to tyranny that's specific and encompassed in one person. Liberalism unchecked turns into a swarm that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it's a very interesting.
Well, it is definitely the danger of openness.
That's right.
Because openness
let more in, right? And the difficulty
the dangers of multiplicity and contamination.
And and in-group favoritism, right? But the difficulty of let's call it tyrannical closedness, right? Taken to the wrong extreme is new ideas and people don't get in and you stagnate and ossify.
That's also the kingdom of stone.
Yes.
Because everything's set in stone. And so, yeah. It's okay. Exodus 9. Then the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh and tell him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if thou refuse to let them go, and wilt hold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle, which is in thy field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, and upon the sheep, there shall be a very grievous murrain. And the Lord shall sever between the cattle of Israel and the cattle of Egypt, And that motif is established in this second cycle of plagues. So now it's just the Egyptians that are clearly suffering from this. And
so now there's a big distinction. Right. And that's very important, because now you're getting the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, protecting his people, at the same time having the ability to inflict damage on the Egyptians, where these would normally be things where people might think, well, you're in close proximity, you're going to get affected by these things. And they're not, which shows, again, that Yahweh is Lord. He is God. He is above anything the Egyptians are worshiping.
so the Lord is marking off his people as immune from the coming.
And he's going to do that same thing when it comes to the firstborn. He protects his own people.
Plagues. And there shall nothing die of all that is the children of Israel. And the Lord appointed a set time, saying, tomorrow the Lord shall do this thing in the land. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow. And all the cattle of Egypt died. But of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, take to you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. Now you had some.
So this is the transition. Like there's now you really see this transition up into heaven, and it happens in a very strange way, which is almost like an anti-burning bush. Which is he's taking soot. Soot is the remainder. It's the residue, right? It's the lowest thing. It's the remainder of a burning process. And so he takes it and he brings it up into the heaven. And then from this moment, you'll see something. All the following plagues will have to do with wind. You'll see the wind that blows the locust, and then the darkness in the sky, the hail and the fire that comes from above. And so it's very interesting, because it's almost like taking the remainder, taking the residue, and lifting it up as a kind of principle. It's a very strange
the amphibious.
behavior.
It's the role that the frogs played, out of water onto land,
right.
out of land into heaven.
So it's
And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt. So it's blowing around, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the land of Egypt.
That it's boils now.
Yeah, these are getting pretty serious, these plagues. And they took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up toward heaven, and it became a boil breaking forth with blains upon man. It's like the bubonic plague, and upon beast.
By the way,
Let's go to our handy-dandy chart. Boils. Isis was the goddess of health, and Imhotep was the god of healing. And their gods of health and healing are not able to cure them from these diseases that have come upon them now.
a lot of people raise the question, why are all the Egyptians suffering? And so that raises the huge issue of, is there such a thing as collective guilt?
Well, there doesn't have to be, Dennis. I don't believe that. One of the things I really learned from Solzhenitsyn in particular, and Rod Dreher has just written about this as well, it's like you can think of the totalitarian state as the people laboring under the burden of Pharaoh. That's sort of the top-down crimes of obedience theory, right? It's authoritarian leaders, the people are basically innocent, and they work for the tyrant under compulsion. Or you can think, and I was just in Albania talking to people about this, and I went to the museum of the House of Leaves, which was the central museum for their KGB equivalent, and they spied on everyone. And all the Albanians I talked to, left and right, they all said the same thing. Under the Soviets, everyone lied about everything to everyone all the time.
This is true of any Soviet thing. So it wasn't the KGB that was spying on you per se. It was your neighbor who was spying on behalf of the KGB. So you couldn't trust them. So who's to blame? Your neighbor? Or Khrushchev in Moscow when you're in Yerevan, Armenia? Or Stalin? Or your uncle's son who's spying on you because they're giving them extra bread?
And so the tyranny is distributed through the entire system.
That was my point, actually.
Yeah. So
I say the Torah does believe in collective guilt, and by the way, there's a verse which I didn't comment on earlier, where it says, and Pharaoh spoke to all his people, all the people participated in the killing of the Jewish children, of the Hebrew children. So I totally agree with what you said. Clearly, there are individuals who resist,
right.
but That is rare.
They're spared sometimes. I mean, you get that story with Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't need that many good individuals for it to be spared. But I don't think it's, the thing is, I think it's important. It's not collective guilt. It's that everybody in a community has the guilt, but it's because they did something wrong. They're lying.
That's right, yes.
And if they, so Solzhenitsyn said famously, you know, one man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny. And we've seen examples of that. I would say Gandhi did that to some degree. Martin Luther King did that to some degree. Solzhenitsyn certainly did that to a great and remarkable degree. And so these things clearly happen. And one word of truth will outweigh the whole world. It's like, well, how can it not? Because the truth is immutable and final.
You have to censor truth.
But it's also the case that an unjust ruler can cause enormous destruction to innocent people. So, I mean, I don't think we have to conclude that they're all.
But he can't do it alone.
Right.
An unjust ruler alone.
His point is right. I mean,
there can still be innocent victims within the collective, which is why it shouldn't be collective.
I don't believe there would have been a Holocaust without Hitler. I believe many Germans are guilty, not all, but many. But I do believe that Hitler made the Holocaust possible.
I think they would have called forth another Hitler.
With regard to a Holocaust or with regard to World War II, they're not the same things.
It wouldn't have been the same Holocaust. Right? I mean, so one of the things I really learned from Jung, because he studied Hitler in great detail and what he accomplished, let's say. So Hitler was a very powerful orator, but he was also a very powerful listener. And Hitler was resentful for a variety of reasons, and he was also obsessed with order and disgust. He's a very strange person. So he had his particular idiosyncrasies that made the Holocaust what it was. But then when he spoke to people, he was like a comedian in the negative sense. So I think I told you guys this story the other day. Jimmy Carr, the comedian, before he goes out on his world tours, he goes and does 50 shows, and he tries out his new material, and all comedians do this. And he tells jokes, and some jokes no one laughs at, so he gets rid of those. But the jokes that people laugh at, he keeps. And so Hitler spoke spontaneously, and he watched the crowds. And every time the crowd went, roar, he'd think, yes, one. And then the crowd would roar about something else, he'd think, two. And soon, everything he said made the crowd roar. And the crowd is a conscienceless mob. And so the conscienceless mob called out the devil in Hitler. Why? Well, the Germans were angry. Well, why? Well, World War I, there were brutalized men everywhere, the Versailles Treaty, the absolute collapse of the economy, their wounded pride. They had reasons to be bitter and nihilistic. And so there was a deep longing for a target, a reason, an external reason. It was the Jews, it was the gypsies, it was the people who are different. They're responsible for this. And Hitler he gave voice to that. He gave voice and emotion to that. And so maybe without Hitler it wouldn't have happened, but maybe another popular...
There should be a warning, by the way, for all Americans, whether you're on the left or the right, not to be bamboozled by people who will take advantage over your fears, who will take advantage over your likes and dislikes and your hurt. Think economically, a certain administration has done something which has impacted you negatively. And then there comes someone who's like, yeah, I hear you. They are the issue. And then you give ear to them and you give power to them, but you're giving it to the bad people. So be very wise about the way you go about these things.
Would have come along and done something equivalent, in a slightly different direction.
Didn't Jung also make the point that it was only possible in Germany because Germany was the most evolved? I'm using the term not literally. Well, they were the furthest away from their archetypal roots, right? It was the most philosophers, it was the most conductors, right? Only at the peak of civilization can you be so far removed from the shadow that the shadow can overtake you.
Well, Jung believed that part of what drove the Nazi spirit forward was the re-sacralization of the political. So Germany had collapsed into a godless materialist atheism in some real sense, and so that brought forth a deep longing for the archetypal gods, and Hitler provided that. Orwell knew that. I mean, when Orwell started to warn about the Nazis, one of the things he warned about, he was so courageous. He said, you underestimate these people. They've harnessed these primordial forces of spectacle and blood and fire and beauty. They've rekindled the ancient gods, and Jung thought it was Odin on the warpath again in some fundamental sense. And so the reason Germany was prone to that, I suppose, is because they were the farthest along the technocratic, materialist, atheist path, and that set up this longing for a return to in some real sense, to the pagan gods.
Well, those who don't remember history are doomed to
be possessed by it again.
Right. And in some ways, it's like
the Nazis knew this. It's not like they didn't play with pagan imagery constantly.
Absolutely, the iconography is very clear.
It doesn't work if you're close to real pagan industry, if it's still interwoven in your life, if you still have, your roots go all the way down into archetypes and ritual.
Well,
and
I suppose the Germans, in some sense, would have been most prone to the temptations of the Luciferian intellect too, because they were extremely successful in their Towers of Babel.
The figure of Faust looms very large in German art and literature, from Goethe onwards. But the Mephistophelian pact is just really fundamental to German culture and German consciousness.
You sell your soul to the devil, not so much for knowledge in some sense, but for power, right? And that can be technological power, but it's not knowledge. It's,
and all of the other things that were being promised in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany, absolutely, yeah.
But artistic power, and it was the power in the elites. It was in the arts. It was in philosophy. It was in music composition. It was in everything.
You could also see that, given that Germany, in some sense, was at the pinnacle of that civilization, the fact that they were so profoundly defeated and then humiliated was also what that produces a wounded pride and narcissism, and that's certainly part of the Luciferian spirit. So, but that idea, look, here's a good example of that. So, when police were interviewing children when they were investigating the satanic daycare accusations back in the 1980s, the children would come up with absolutely hair-raising tales of satanic ritual abuse, like young children. You think, well, where do they get that? Well, often what would happen was that a child with a mother who is a paranoid schizophrenic or bordering on it would start to get delusional about what people might have been doing to her child when she left them in the daycare. Now, she was guilty because she left them in the daycare. And now she's wondering, oh, I left my children with strangers. What could they be up to? And then because she was bordering on psychosis, she'd have these incredible delusional fantasies. And then, being disturbed, she'd start to bother her children. It's like, wait, does anybody do anything to you? And children partly construct the way that they react to the world by looking at whether what they say grasps the attention of adults. And so the child would be struggling to find the words that would satisfy the mother's curiosity, and struggling with that, and then they'd go to sleep at night and have a dream. And the dream would get nightmarish, and that's because the dream was trying to model what it is that the mother was calling forth out of them. And then you could run that for a couple of weeks, and the child would be telling all sorts of horrific stories. And then the police would come in, and they'd investigate in relationship to the children, and they'd get even more grotesque and catastrophic fantasies out of the kids. And then they'd think, well, the kids couldn't be inventing this, but they weren't. They were co-inventing it. And this is what happened in some sense to Hitler under the sway of the German people. It's like he had his flaws, many of them, right? Many, wounded narcissism being not paramount among them, because he was also very orderly and disgust sensitive.
Which is funny because he had suppurating gums. So it's like, poor guy.
Yeah, well, right.
Like he was like, vile in certain senses, and then overcoming it and scouring rats and homeless and Slavs and Jews with his own like disdain for his, twisted psyche.
And for his own mortality. Right? And he was a worshiper of the will. He was perfectly proud that he could stand like this for hours on end in the back of a car. He regarded that as a signal evidence of his discipline and conscientiousness, but in any case, Hitler was willing to go exactly where the mob took him, and was already motivated to go in a very dark direction. He'd been rejected, by the Vienna School of Art 3 times. He was a struggling street artist. He'd been brutalized by World War I. He was a decorated war hero. I think he was the only survivor of part of his platoon because a grenade blew up all of his friends when he was off doing something peripheral. And so he had a survivor's complex as well, and an idea that he had a destiny because of that. And then he was homeless, as you pointed out. And of course, the communists were threatening Germany at the time, and there were reason to be paranoid about that. And it was all set up for a perfect storm. But Hitler definitely allowed the mob to call forth the darkest fantasies possible out of the recesses of his soul.
In light of that, I'd like to read to you what Heinrich Heine, the great German poet, wrote exactly 100 years before Hitler came to power. And this is so relevant to our themes of the need for God and religion. So this is a secular Jew writing this, the great German poet Heinrich Heine. Christianity, and this is its greatest merit, has somewhat mitigated that brutal German love of war, but it could not destroy it. Should that subduing talisman, the cross, be shattered, the frenzied madness of the ancient warriors, that insane berserk rage of which Nordic bards have spoken and sung so often, will once more burst into flame. This talisman, the cross, is fragile, and the day will come when it will collapse miserably. Then a play will be performed in Germany, which will make the French Revolution look like an innocent walk in the park.
Wow.
The Wartburg.
Isn't that unbelievable?
What? When was that written?
1834.
Wow.
The Wartburg,
the prophetic voice,
is a very important.
Wow.
Building for German consciousness, because it was where Luther hid away as Junker Jörg when he was obviously in danger. And it was in the Wartburg that he threw the ink pot at the devil. You can still see the bit of ink on the in Luther's cell. And apparently, in 1933, the Nazis tried to replace the cross, because in the Wartburg there's always a cross a flag of the cross flying. And in 1933, when the Nazis took power, they replaced the cross with the swastika.
Mm-hmm. It's an anti-cross. The swastika is an anti-cross.
And the locals wouldn't have it. They had to take the swastika down, which is quite interesting in terms of this tension between the Christian inheritance, and of course this was particularly associated with Luther, and then the attempt to, as it were, repress that Christian inheritance that you found, among the Nazis. Particularly Himmler. But,
Jordan, one of my favorite observations you've had is when you said, if you're scared of strong men, you should be terrified of what weak men can do. Mm-hmm. And I always think about that with Hitler, such a great example of that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that bitterness and that resentment, that feeling of
that, lack of positive masculinity, let's say, right, of integration.
Well, and also in some sense, also no clear pathway forward. It wasn't like it was a picnic for ex-soldiers in Germany in the 1920s. So, we always have to remember that a fair bit of his suffering in some sense was come by honestly. It was no joke to be in the trenches. It's no joke to have all your friends die. It's no joke to be homeless and rejected. And so I'm not obviously justifying any of that, because people can come out of that not being Hitler, let's say. But
the power of a resentful populism is something we should keep a very close eye
on. Always.
Yeah, that's for sure. In every way. Yeah. Resentment. I never saw anything among my clinical clients that was more destructive than resentment. And that's the...
By the way, I see this quite a bit with the conservative types as well. I think a lot of people, and I'm not talking about like conservatives in the traditional sense of the word, like what I would call neoconservatism, where it takes these feelings that they have as to what's going on and the direction that the left is taking everything, and then it's coming out of resentment, not an attachment to that which is true, good, and beautiful. Not an attachment to something that we have to conserve, this beautiful thing we have to conserve. Where a lot of people that I'm seeing, these neoconservative types, rather are acting out of the dislike of what the other is doing. And I think that's a very dangerous direction to go into, and we have to be very, very careful with that.
Spirit of Cain, right? That not only am I resentful, but it's justifiable. I can shake my fist at God, and I have the right on my side. It's really not good. Maybe it's worse than pride. And they're intertangled,
the only thing that competes with it is betrayal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can't appeal to betrayal the way you can appeal to resentment.
Right.
You can suffer from betrayal, but you can appeal to resentment.
So, resentment justifies anything.
Yes. Yeah, and that's also the underground motivation for resentment. Like if you're possessed by the desire for power, you can certainly capitalize on your resentment. So,
Dennis, can I ask very quickly? You just started this fascinating phase of our discussion by talking about the way in which you think the Torah endorses some kind of notion of collective guilt.
In the way that the Torah was talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just think there are two kinds. There's one that's sort of, collective guilt in the present. But the debate that's really haunting the political landscape at the moment is the kind of whether there's a kind of diachronic
that has an answer.
collective guilt.
God bless you. That is a great distinction, and the Torah has an antidote. There is a law in the Torah. Law. It's a commandment from God himself. You may not hate the Egyptians. Okay. Right. So that ends that whole issue. Yep. Egypt is no longer guilty. Whites are no longer guilty, if that's what you had in mind.
And that's symbolized in ceremonially with the drops of wine.
Right. Did I mention that on it? I didn't? Okay, so very quickly, at the Passover Seder, and as I noted, it's universal. It was not at all specific to my family or community. When the 10 plagues are listed at the Passover Seder, the Jew puts the pinky into the cup of wine. We drink 4 cups of wine. Those who can handle it, I can't. And you remove some wine with each plague as your way of saying, I'm not going to increase but decrease my happiness over their suffering.
So there's no schadenfreude there.
Right. The tradition is better than me. If I did 10 plagues over Germany, I'm not sure I would dip my finger in. When I read about the bombings
If
of
you don't have
Germany,
sympathy,
I'm very torn.
If you don't have sympathy for that, it's very difficult to understand it. You know, meaning one of the things I tried to do when I was reading about the Nazi atrocities is I tried to imagine myself as an Auschwitz guard who enjoyed it.
This is good.
And that takes sympathy. It's a very dangerous thing to do, you know, and no one wants to do that because when people read about the Holocaust, they want to think, well, they'd be a victim or they'd be a hero, a redeeming hero. It's like statistically, well, maybe you'd be a victim, but the probability you'd be a redeeming hero in the face of the Hitlerian nightmares.
minimal.
I think it's
minimal.
the only inoculation that one would have to not do that, to say, I'd be the one who'd get out of line and stand with the Jews and be executed, is if you know that you in all likelihood would not be that person.
Right.
Then you have a chance.
That's
I
right,
wrote,
that's
I wrote
right.
a screenplay. I was adapted a wonderful book called Black Flags. It won the Pulitzer by Joby Warwick. It's spectacular. It's about Zarqawi. And Zarqawi was, in many regards, incredibly flawed, horrifying, monstrous genius, right? He revolutionized terrorism, basically. He had a big plan to drop a chemical bomb on Amen, and it was the Mukhabara got ahead of it, and so he figured he could kidnap one American tourist and saw his head off, right, Nick Berg. And in doing so, he made sure it was recorded in a particular way that broadband was just becoming accessible in the U.S., and he made sure it was exactly released in a format that it could go the most widely to the U.S. to have the biggest impact, and it's the lowest resources. He personalized terror. And one of my theses when I was writing about him was that, you know, he's like Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs looked at a phone long enough until it was no longer a phone. He was transformative. There's something that was godlike in his ability to figure out exactly the most excruciating forms of terrorism. He was so bad that bin Laden apologized for him. And every 2 weeks, because when you're writing a character, you have to inhabit them. The goal is to pull on their mask and see the world through their eye holes. And every 2 weeks, I would watch again, when I was writing this, the beheading. And it was horrifying. I mean, it's like that full body sweat, like and it's horrifying, and the sound of it. But it was like, I'm not going to lose myself in moral relativism, right? But I'm writing from him. I have to write from his position of where he came from and how he was radicalized and what about him was brilliant, right? And what campaign and what his grievances were. But I kept mooring myself in that. You go back and watch that again, and it's like, it's inconceivable almost to witness once, let alone. But I think that's part of what you're saying about trying to find.
Well, I think it's also part of that motif of taking the world's sins upon yourself. It's like, well, people did this, and you're a person. And you think, well, no, I couldn't. It's like, don't be so sure about that. And then maybe there's something even worse, which is, if you're so sure you couldn't do it, you might be so sure you couldn't do it in precise proportion to the degree that you would be vulnerable to do it if the situation was right.
Yeah, so when I had, one of my guests, why am I forgetting his name? We spoke about genocide and evil and the problem of evil. And this is essentially what all the research shows. Exactly what they're talking about. We shouldn't be so sure that we wouldn't participate in these things. Or at the very least, if not actively participate in it, that many of us wouldn't speak up and would just remain silent.
Like Germany in the 1930s, so evolved, right?
Right, exactly.
So wondrously evolved. It's the last place something like that could happen. It's like, nope, it's the only place that's going to happen.
Well, that's what they always asked. How could the country that produced Beethoven, Goethe, and Schiller produce Auschwitz? I resonate to the question, and I don't resonate to the question, because I would say of the 10 saddest revelations of my life, and this was one of the first, because I'm crazy about classical music. It's deeply important to my life. And I had to make peace with the fact that you could love Mozart and build Auschwitz. It hurt me terribly.
Well,
I really thought it makes you better to love Bach.
Yeah, well, that's the whole...
It might be, and I'm not very sure whether Dennis Prager believes this or not, but I don't know what his view of original sin is. Could be that. Could be that he just thinks that people... Like, for me, it's not very difficult knowing that people would be able to love that kind of beautiful stuff and just be evil to the core.
Of the human experience, though, isn't it? That spans the entire range. And, you know, part of that Christian idea that the Savior of the world takes the sins upon himself, that really means to encompass that entire span and then to try to reconcile it. And the span stretches, what does Jung say? A tree that wants to reach up into heaven has to grow its roots all the way into hell. And I think that's really true, because how can you defeat the devil without understanding him? And if the devil's in your heart, then you have to understand that in your heart.
It's your only inoculation.
It's your only inoculation. You mean to see yourself going there and then decide not to, or see how you could go there?
Also to engage with it in a way that doesn't make it wholly alien to you.
Right.
The inoculation is to try to engage with it in some manner. And so in the process of writing this is very intimate when I'm writing something, I'm in it 24/7. And so if I'm writing this story, the inoculation, it's like going in and trying to understand
Well,
it.
your books have got better and better, and I would say more and more successful as your villains have got more and more human. Not that they're not better villains in the moral sense. They're worse and worse.
Right,
But they're
well,
also
that-
more and more understandable and human. And that makes them much more terrifying, strangely enough.
I think I had to grow up enough to realize that antagonists and protagonists are much more compelling than villains and heroes. Because I started...
So just about your reflection about Mozart and Goethe, for that matter. And by the way, Goethe was an anti-nationalist. I mean, Goethe was at a time where German nationalism was very important. He was very hostile to the idea, and I think one has to remember the extent of German resentment going through the centuries, and this was partly to do with the Holy Roman Empire and what they call the Kleinstaatlerei, the very divided nature of the German regions, and for that reason their sense of vulnerability. And you had that sense that at the Reformation Germany had been divided. Then you have Germany at the mercy of very powerful neighboring nation, particularly France. So the humiliation by France under Louis XIV. Then Napoleon. Many of those who died in Napoleon's Russian campaign were Germans. The Bavarians in particular, but in large numbers. So the Germans had this long-standing feeling that they were weak, that they were humiliated. So the First World War comes on the back of this long, centuries sense of being humiliated, abused, and a deep sense of resentment. The idea that French is the cultured language. That French, I mean, the German aristocracy, they would speak French to each other. You know, French was, of course, the language of the court. Frederick the Great's castle was called Sans Souci. He thought German, the greatest, the king of Prussia, thought German was a pretty nasty language, really. So I think your point about resentment in the soul as being this deeply poisonous and transformative power is very significant in this.
The story of Cain is so unbelievably powerful because...
So it's not just how does this amazingly sophisticated, scientifically brilliant, poetic, the Land der Dichter und Denker, the land of poets and thinkers, how did it suddenly become so satanic? It's also a long history of resentment and feeling of being humiliated, and we need to take our place.
Well, resentment...
Again, I would say this is more so the case. I would warn conservatives and individuals who lean conservative because of tradition, because of whatever reason, to be very, very careful not to go down this resentment path. And this might be partly why Jesus even tells us, hey, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Because when you do that, when you love your enemies and you pray for those who persecute you, you don't resent them. That's just like a very practical outcome of that. If we don't watch out for that, I see conservatives falling into the trap, or people who lean conservative falling into the trap of having that kind of resentment where they'll give up their freedom, they'll give up their power to extremely nasty individuals out there.
Also, resentment's a real rough one, too, because it's really easy to confuse with the desire for justice, right? And there is a desire for justice and a need for it, but resentment perverts the sense of justice. It perverts it to your own ends because it perverts justice to the designs of revenge, essentially. And that revenge can become, really, it becomes cosmic. I mean, I've read a lot about the thinking and writing of serial killers and people who shot up high schools and that kind of thing. And what you see is that the deeper the crime, the more cosmic the resentment. And it's really the case. It gets to the point where the only language you can use to describe the motivation is satanic. And often the perpetrators themselves use that language, right?
Well, think how impersonal your anger has to be, how cosmic it has to be to slaughter a school full of people who you hardly know. Stephen, I feel like, has been our Jiminy Cricket of conscience, pointing out the choice, the constant choice, and with the Pharaoh and the strengthening. And one of the things I'm thinking about so much is we're regarding this text, which is, no matter, it's a holy text, right? No matter whether that's a capital H or a lowercase h, depending on how people go to it. And one of the ways to engage with any text of meaning, we were talking yesterday about Rogerian listening, right? Where you engage at the nervous system. And part of it is when we're reading this, part of what we're doing is practicing the question, I think, Dennis, that you're raising, because we all also have to be the Pharaoh in some regards if you're going to engage with a text, right? One of the jobs of writing or carving, right, or creating any kind of art is like, I think about Caravaggio all the time, where some minor player in the background is fully three-dimensionalized. We're not just meant to be the role of Moses when we're reading this. We're meant to also embrace and engage and see the Pharaoh in ourselves. And that's something, like, you keep bringing that back to the personal and psychological also. And I think that's that notion of the inoculating factor is, why are we spending so much time with somebody who's so stubborn that he keeps hardening his heart and people are dying and all this happens? It's like, that's us also, right? And just like in...
And it's also the thing in us that keeps us from claiming the freedom that allows us to serve God properly. So he's really the antithetical enemy. And you can say, well, what the biblical corpus does in large part is walk you through all the domains of mankind. It's right. Here's the whole panoply of the possible human experience.
Embody them all. Listen to them, like, attend to them.
Like they're you.
Like, yeah, as Rogers did. Soften yourself to the vulnerability of encountering all
Well, it
them.
also lets the text speak to you. You know, I think part of the reason that the first biblical series I did was serious was because I approached the text as if it might have something to teach me. That was the a priori presumption, right? Which is what you have to do if you read a text that's written by great thinkers, too. It's like, well, Nietzsche's a good example. It's like, well, that was Nietzsche, you know? You might give some credence to the notion that there's something in there to learn. And maybe you don't take all of it. You can take the right spoils from the Egyptians in the service of the right thing. And maybe you leave some of what's there behind. But that in the Passion story, which what it's doing in part is it's taking you through all of that all at once, right? Because you're a Pilate who says what is truth, and you're the tyrannical Roman, and you're the mob that calls for the death of the innocent.
And you're washing your hands.
You bet, you bet. And you have to be, as well as being the suffering person who's taking all of this on. And all of that has to be equally real. And maybe then you decide which of those characters you'd rather be aligned with, you know? And,
well, the practice of this right now, part of what, like you were talking about, Dennis, earlier, that everything's a miracle. The birth of an ant is a miracle. Like us being here having this discussion. We're increasingly in a culture where our engagement with things is so bifurcated. We're not allowed to even engage with there's no conceivable notion to engage with the full perspective of the other side. And there's 100 ways that define that beyond just the obviously red and blue. And it's like we keep, and so much of what
if you demonize the other, you don't have to embody it.
That's right.
That's convenient.
You dehumanize. It's not a part of you. And so much of what the study of text is, what the study of story is that form of an inoculation for your own individuation. That's what we're doing here.
That's right. Well, that's what should happen in a humanities education, is that, no, you have to embody all these characters.
Right.
So, well, gentlemen, that seems like a meat place to stop, I would say. We've run out our 2 hours, and we got through a lot of material, and I was wondering at the beginning of this, well, we'll probably just zip through the plagues because there's this repetition, and it turns out, well, just as you'd expect, that if you pay enough attention to the text, there's nothing to run through quickly. All right, so thank you, everyone, for who's watching and listening, and thank you once again to the Daily Wire crew for setting this up, and to all of you for taking the time and effort necessary in this really miraculous occurrence, I would say, and I really do view it that way. It's unbelievably unlikely that we've been able to assemble ourselves like this, and to be able to talk like this, and to be able to bring this to the attention of many, many people. And it's very appropriate not to underestimate the likelihood of something like that occurring, and being appreciative of it, as I think we all are in a very deep sense. And also to the people the technical people and everyone whose faith in this unlikely venture has made it possible.
And is not the gratitude a part of the genuinely religious mind in the way that resentment is a part of...
It's the opposite of... Gratitude is the opposite of resentment. That's why you want to practice it as a virtue. It's like, what do I have to be grateful for? Look at my suffering. It's like, well, it's incumbent upon you to discover that which you should be grateful for. Yeah, especially if you're suffering. You know, especially if you're suffering. We really learned that with Michaela, is to try to find, it's like in all that pain, to try to find what you can hold on to that's real in the midst of that. And that's an orientation towards gratitude.
You move towards where you put your attention. I mean, that's exactly what we're
right
discussing.
That gratitude is also maybe a note to end on, because I think this is Douglas's last session with us this time around.
Yes. I do believe that we're going to rekindle this. This is August right now, or end of July. And I do believe we plan to rekindle this in January, because we won't get through the whole book. And yes, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here, and a real privilege to have you come here. And it's also been, for all of you who are listening, it's been ridiculously fun. We've been jet skiing around on the ocean in Miami. And so when we're not studying the book of Exodus and eating steaks and drinking bourbon, not me, even though I'd like to. Anyways, Douglas, thank you very much for coming. And it's been great to have you here, and look forward to having you here again for sure. So.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. That was episode 4, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you got the entire image, I think, of the 10 plagues is God battling the God of the Israelites, Yahweh battling in a certain sense, the gods of the Egyptians, overcoming them, including Pharaoh, so that they would know that he is God and there is none like him. If you read Exodus and you specifically read the 10 plagues and you get that, you've interpreted it properly. You've gotten the point. You know what's going on.